I'm David Matthews, and this is my treasure chest. Now, today I've got a lot of compost in here, and this comes from the compost heap down the garden. It's quite good stuff. Indeed, as you can see from the temperature, which we'll take from the heat right here, it's in the red hot range. Now, you may remember the excellent couplet, "There was a girl who was so pure, she could not say the word manure." Well, this being the absolute index of purity, it's surprising that Jesus himself talked about manure. And here it is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 13. He told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I've come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and I find none. Cut it down." And he replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year, until I dig round it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, then well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." Well, this isn't a horticultural lesson, though the advice is not bad. The parable is about spiritual growth, which brings me to all the other things that I've got in my chest here. There's some Tomerite, and what's this? Liquid plant food. Miracle Grow. Onion, garlic and shallot feed. And some copper mixture for element deficiencies. And this is some fertiliser that, I don't know what it is, it was in a box that got damp, and so I decanted it into here. It's just some fertiliser. Now, why, you may ask, have I got all of these different fertilisers in my shed? And the answer you know already is that different plants like different fertilisers, and indeed different fertilisers at different stages of growth. So I'm using a really dilute solution of Miracle Grow here for the tomatoes today, and won't use Tomerite until the fruits are pea-sized. And this too is a parable, because our spiritual growth needs different fertilisers. These fertilisers are many, but a few are obvious. Prayer and Bible reading and Holy Communion, sometimes referred to as the means of grace. But then so much else helps us to grow. Hymns and poems and music, meditation and reading and listening to preaching, and indeed preaching itself, and walking in the countryside and laughing and indeed sometimes crying. But I want to assure you today that it doesn't matter very much if you don't get on well with one fertiliser or another. You may or may not be very good at prayer. I'm actually not, at least in the conventional sense of extempore word-together prayers. On the other hand, you may not like hymns or responses in services. You may love waving your arms around in celebration, or feel terribly embarrassed. You may love exchanging the peace, or regard it as anathema. The important thing is to find some way, or indeed some ways, to move a bit closer to the kingdom of God. To get to understand Jesus and what he was saying and what he says now. Don't beat yourself up because one or other spiritual fertiliser doesn't suit you. Use the ones that do. Now, a couple of stories about compost and manure. I was talking on this subject at a service here in Oxford Circuit and did this. I produced this compost in a bucket, and there was a lady in the front of the church with a heavily bandaged leg propped up on a chair. She clearly hadn't seen a compost heap in a while, if ever at all. So I walked over to her and asked her what she thought of my compost. She said she thought it was very good indeed. Well, The word indeed triggered me into the following question. Indeed, I said. You know about compost? I am the queen of compost, she replied. It turned out that she'd spent many years in East Africa, teaching the local population about agriculture in general and compost in particular. It was inspirational. And so here, unexpectedly, was another moment of spiritual growth. And perhaps, commonly, our growth is fertilised by the most important blessing of all, other faithful, graceful, and loving people. Finally, let me show you this little experiment that was set up at school by my A-level biology teacher, Mr. Bailey, to show that compost produces methane. Now, I've got some compost here under water with a gas jar stand, a funnel and an inverted test tube full of water. Over time, the methane should bubble up from the compost and come up the test tube here so that we could see it. But in fact, the experiment is too small to work. It's not going to produce any methane of note. But my colleague in the sixth form, what is called year 13 now, came along and let a little air into the test tube, like this. I was outraged. What are you doing? I asked. You're ruining the experiment. Well, he said, Bailey's a good man and we need to encourage him. It'll make him happy if he thinks this has worked. And so day by day, he let a little more air into the test tube. Bailey, it turned out, was pleased. This taught me another important spiritual lesson, that in the light of God's kingdom, it's often more important to focus on the person rather than the science.